The root of the problem in the sustainability crisis is a loss of the sacred. Through conversations with scientists, theologians, scholars, thought leaders, and friends of the Spirituality and Sustainability Global Network, Make It Sacred explores the intersectionality of spirituality and sustainability and why this intersection is critical at our existential societal tipping point. Without spiritual grounding, we won't have a commitment or political will to create hope for sustainability. Co-creation always starts with a conversation. And what are we co-creating? A spiritually grounded passion that comes from a sacred understanding of the earth. Hi, my name is Maddie, and I'll be your host as we start these conversations together. A scholar with very wide-ranging interests, César Baldelomar is a Ph.D. candidate in Theology and Education at Boston College. His research blends critical theory and decolonial thought, exploring how knowledge production and consumption inform the formation of identities. His work seeks to find different ways to imagine and talk about the self and about justice in an effort to envision personal, social, and educational ethical paradigms that could serve as possible sites of resistance. He holds 2 law degrees from St. Thomas University School of Law and 2 master's degrees from Harvard. He is also the co-founder of Learning for Life Solutions and a former legal intern at the Southern Poverty Law Center and an associate member representative of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States. CJ also just received a book contract with the tentative title Fragmented Theological Imaginings. If you hear us referencing a previous interview in this interview, I will link it in the notes below. We had the pleasure of speaking about 2 years ago about conversation, and that was an equally wonderful conversation. I'm always so grateful to talk with CJ because I learn so much from him. He is such a thoughtful and wise person, and we have really valued his influence and participation on the board of the SSGN. Also, if you would like to support the SSGN and future educational initiatives like this one, you can subscribe to the podcast and also leave a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you are interested in donating financially, you can go to our website and hit the donate button. I'll also link that in the notes below. Thank you so much for being here and for supporting us with your ears, and let's get into this wonderful conversation with CJ. I hope you learn as much as I did.
Imaginings and imagination, all that still is very much part of my work. Mm-hmm. Just lately, my work has taken a darker turn.
Yeah.
And it's funny, in conversations with Joe Holland lately, I've been speaking to him, we've reconnected. Mm-hmm. And it's very funny because his book, Postmodern Ecological Spirituality, toward the end, he kind of ends, his book is about hope, but he ends on a very kind of dark note. He's saying, unless we start making the changes now, we're done. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a message that we need to repeat. It's because the difference this time around is ecological devastation. So, societies have come and gone. We know that this is nothing new. As Lamentations would say, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Actually, Ecclesiastes will say that.
Yeah.
It's the same.
No, I love that verse.
Yeah, it's like there is nothing new under the sun. Things have come and gone, and they just reappear in different forms. But in reality, we're just recycling ideas over and over and ways of living. And so the question is, how can, through our imagination, can we break free from these loops and envision new forms of living, new forms of inventing, new forms of loving? I mean, different arrangements. We're talking about a complete, kind of just a complete change. And but then, as we'll talk today, once you start doing something cutting edge or something countercultural, it unfortunately finds its way back into popular discourse and popular culture. And so it kind of loses its power in some ways. And that's the curse and blessing of capitalism, really,
Yeah. When you said that in the interview, sort of fringe movements or marginalized people becoming the center, I thought a lot about the gay rights movement and how all of a sudden that's become a political weapon and a tool that is fueling things, when really like these people, it's a good thing because people are gaining acceptance and recognition and they have a platform to speak about who they are and their experience. But at the same time, you can tell sometimes certain people or certain politicians are using this very fringe thing as their own weapon, sort of.
100%. And that's why, I've caught a lot of flap over the last year and a half or so when I talk about identity politics, right? Because unfortunately, identity politics has a conservative tone to it. So when somebody says, "Oh, those are identity politics," what they envision is Donald Trump saying, "Why are we doing this?" And white people, everybody should have equal rights. And yeah, of course, I think everybody should have equal rights. But what I mean by identity politics is pitting these groups against each other. Rather than building coalition or establishing solidarity, it now becomes kind of a game of who can trump whom based off of how marginalized they are. So it becomes a competition for marginalization, and that can become very dangerous because then, all we are getting into are biographies, and that's important. We need biographies, but it becomes a game of judging and, seeing who, like, this person must be marginalized because they have tattoos. Or it becomes, this person is not marginalized at all because they are white, and we know that that's not true. There are different types of marginalization, different circles of marginalization, different centers. So it's a very complex concept when we talk about marginalization. And what politicians have done, thanks actually to some philosophers and theologians, is really simplify it. And we're back to the whole Marxian, like there's an oppressor and an oppressed. And it's just not that simple. Power is so much more complex. We all wield it, right? Even within so-called marginalized communities, there are those who run those communities.
Yeah.
And then there are those marginalized within marginalized communities. Marcella Altus Reed, one of my favorite theologians, she calls them the different circles of hell. In one of her books, she explains how in Argentina and Buenos Aires, the first circle includes, the decent prostitutes, what she calls the escorts, who are high end, getting paid over $1,000, whatever.
Work for politicians, things like that.
Exactly. And then the second level includes, the escorts that you find at the brothels. And then the third level are the prostitutes addicted to, certain types of drugs, and they're selling their bodies for like $80. And then there's the last level, who are the disposable bodies that, people sleep with and then they kill and nobody ever searches for them. So even within the so-called, community of prostitution, right, there are centers and there are margins, and it's just so complex. And I think we don't have imagination when we talk about marginalization or oppression, because they're everywhere at all times, and different types too. We can talk about body image. We can talk about, being tall versus being short, right? I mean, it's different types of marginalization. It's not so easy to just say, black body, totally marginalized and oppressed, which again, I'm not negating that there is oppression for black people in the country. But, what about immigrants who stay invisible, and can't go to the police at all for anything, right? Because the fear of being caught and deported, and their family being caught and deported. I mean, it's just, we need to complexify the discussion, and that's where imagination comes in.
Yeah. And I think creativity plays a large part in that too, because we can talk about these statistics and demographics and further categorize people all day. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. That stuff is not as powerful as hearing someone speak and hearing them tell their story. And at the same time of all of this happening, we also have this incredible connectivity of social media and the internet. So also sort of at the same time, there is this platform and ability for people to be able to speak. I mean, obviously you have to have some privilege to have access to the internet and a phone and everything.
100%.
But there's also that tool. One of the most powerful things, I think, I worked in college on a research project with a professor who was a geographer and a sociologist. And I think he actually wrote a book about the project. I'll have to, if I can find it, I'll have to send it to you. But it was called Living Together, Living Apart. And he took redlining maps of the 20s and 30s and outlined them on top of current census data.
Wow.
And you could see that the demographics of the neighborhoods hadn't really changed at all. And so I interestingly came into the project because I emailed him wanting to do a similar project. And he was like, hey, I'm already working on this. You can come on. But I grew up in a 99% Black neighborhood as a child that was very poor. And so I had connections to a lot of people like in the specific neighborhood that he was studying. But what we did is instead of, just like making more statistics, there was the maps that you could see it visually, but we went in and we did really lengthy interviews and portraits of the people, hearing their like life stories. And so like hearing those powerful stories of like this woman I grew up with who was my friend and a leader in my church, hearing that she as an elementary school child was selling drugs so she could feed herself, that's the kind of stuff that is powerful and changes people's lives and minds, not hearing like, oh, Black people are more likely to sell drugs.
Exactly. It's the stories, it's the, as you're saying, the context. There's this book also that you reminded me of with redlining, as you mentioned, the book that you were part of the study.
Mm-hmm.
This book is called A World More Concrete.
Okay.
And it traces Miami real estate, right? And it shows you again where certain people end up on which side of the expressways, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it shows that the first park for African Americans in Miami was under a bridge, right? So it shows you kids weren't getting the sun, they were getting all the fumes from the cars. And this was only in the 1960s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it just shows the inequality with land use, with politics. And we're seeing kind of a reversal here, right? We're seeing in some ways, people are all, getting riled up with the Supreme Court decisions. And the funny, not the funny thing, the tragic thing is I've been saying this for the last decade. It's like, let's stop depending on legal fiat for recognition and for respect. And right, as you said, gay rights, for example, important, but again, politicians take that and mobilize it in their own ways, right? To either work against them or work for them and get votes and then just ignore the agenda altogether once the votes are in. And it's the same thing with abortion. It'll be the same thing with just any privacy issue. Politicians pounce on it, use it for their agenda, and then completely forget about it, once they're in power. And we see that with women's rights, with privacy rights, as it pertains to abortion. This decision has been a long time coming, and people are surprised. I'm not. And, you can expect similar reversals of other civil rights gains in the next few years. And that's why we need to find creative, imaginative ways to resist and to also build coalitions, right? It just can't be depending on politics or dependent on legal fiat, which both are important, but to put all your eggs in those baskets, I think that's where we run into the issues and the frustrations that we've been seeing.
Mm-hmm. I remember last time when we talked too, you talked a lot about comparing the Bible to how people, street theater and resistance, and how some of those scenes from the Bible that we just think of as funny or things we all know, like Jesus on, I can't remember the specific ones you said. I think it was Jesus on the donkey. Yeah. And throwing over the tables in the temple. Like we know those as stories and we don't think very much of them within the historical context, but the things like that are very creative ways of resistance, I think, that you're speaking about.
Absolutely. And Augusto, his name is Augusto Boal. Was a Brazilian playwright and also very much involved with the theater of the oppressed. Mm-hmm. So whereas Paulo Freire developed the the pedagogy of the oppressed, Augusto went a different way and said, we should get people to move. We should get people to be like creative. It's not just about the literature. It's important to sit around and read and discuss things. But how about we act out our frustrations? We act out our, tragedies, our comedies, our day-to-days, so that people can see that not all the poor are the same everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what he tried to show. He tried to show, hey, yes, we're poor, but that doesn't mean we don't enjoy life. Like, stop romanticizing us and ontologizing us. That was the message of the whole theater of the oppressed. It's like, no, we have range of emotions as well. And, we mess up from time to time as well. And we're not innocent in all this. And that's the message that they were trying to send, that nobody's innocent, that oppression, marginalization are just different facets of life. And they've been around since human civilization began, and they'll be around until human civilization ends. So the question is how to get rid of these utopian dreams while still feeling them and inhabiting them, but how to get rid of them for something that's a little bit more realistic, right? More day to day. And I think, again, creativity, imagination actually can help dispel utopias. It's very strange. It's a reversal. I think a lack of imagination leads to utopia because it's like we can only imagine a perfect way of being, and that's not, as we know, that's not what artists try to create, right? Rappers like Tupac, one of my favorite. It's all about that. It's all about talking about day-to-day struggles. And another thing we leave out are the contradictions inherent in us. It's like Tupac can go one song where he sings about his mother, for example, or another song called Keep Your Head Up, which is one of the most women positive rap songs of all time, especially coming from, a so-called gangster rapper.
Mm-hmm.
And then he turns around in the next album and he sings, all about having sex with multiple women and, we're at the club partying and all this. So it's like those contradictions are part of life. And we don't examine that. That's what art does. It examines these contradictions. It also elicits desires of all kinds that are hidden in our day-to-day lives, right? It forces us to take off some of our masks little by little. And that's what I'm after in my work, my research, my teaching. And of course, it's the desire part is very tricky in teaching because, again, we have to be aware also as teachers, the power that we have and the dynamics with students. And so for teachers, the struggle is always, how do you talk about things in an honest way without impeding the student's personal trajectory or, the moment they're in? Because then that can also be a negative form of violence if you immediately instill in a student what you're thinking without the student having gone through your life experiences or, the process of reading several texts or engaging several experiences. It's always tricky. It's always tricky when you're trying to convey something. And therefore art, whether it's literature, painting, music, theater, technology, art and technology, whatever it is, it's a much better way to express things than, the traditional way of let me write an essay for you, which essays, again, and I think I said this in our last conversation, essays have their place and they've had their place. But now we're seeing an explosion of art in all forms. And, some people decry TikTok era and all that, but I see it as a positive. It's just another form of technology. That's all it is. It's nothing new under the sun. It's just more viewers. That's all.
Yeah. And I think too, with artistic expression, there's more left to the observer for you to decide what it means to you, as opposed to straight writing or telling what your ideas are.
Exactly.
And that's powerful.
Absolutely. And the best authors, I think, are the ones who leave it up to you, right? To decide what they mean and are very curt with their explanations. And they're also very suspicious of saying, well, this is my biographical information, right? Because what they want is for you to focus on the text, right? And see how the text speaks to you. If I already give you biographical information, you're going to have that in your mind, and then you're going to assume that the biography I'm giving you is what has shaped the text. And of course it has, right? But you're going to start filling in certain gaps with biography rather than with ideas. And so that's why certain authors abstain from talking so much about themselves or their background. A famous philosopher, Michel Foucault, was like that. He would even interview under different names or would give no name. He would be called the masked philosopher, just so people can pay attention to the ideas instead of the celebrity or the person behind it.
That's really interesting. Let's back up a little bit, because I want, for the sake of listeners, to know who you are and kind of where you come from culturally and how that brought you to these ideas that you're wrestling with now.
It's a good question, especially given what we just discussed about biography and works. So I grew up in, and it's a question I don't get too often, right? Even when I write articles about where I'm from, one in Commonweal about what happened with the insurrection, I traced it back to where I'm from and kind of the conservative leanings of the city where I grew up in and the school I went to. I come from Hialeah, Florida. Hialeah, Florida is a city within Miami-Dade County. It's about 3-4 miles away from Miami proper. And so we say we're from Miami just because people don't know where Hialeah is. But interestingly enough, Hialeah is, I think, the third most conservative city in the United States. And it's overwhelmingly Latino. It's I think, 90% plus Hispanic, the majority of whom are Cuban. And so there's a whole history there of conservatism in the city. And I went to a Catholic high school where the majority of the teachers were conservative. And again, no problem with being conservative. I'm all for having conversations across political ideologies. And I myself am suspicious of anybody who holds too much to a political party, right? Ideology, parties, different things. So I don't have problems with those. But I grew up, for example, hearing phrases like, let's just bomb the Middle East, let's get rid of it. You know, it's like people would just say that in casual conversation on the streets, or while I'm waiting at the doctor's office or something as a kid. And I remember as a 6-year-old hearing these things, and I was like, I would ask my parents, like, why do people say these things? You know, and then they're like, well, you know, some people have misunderstandings. And already my parents were explaining to me, people have misunderstandings of other people from around the world. And, you know, they just make blanket statements, stereotypes. And so I was very, very aware of this as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old. I was always asking these questions. And, you know, my parents they had escaped from Nicaragua during the communist revolution there, and then went to Honduras, and then from Honduras to the US.
Do you think, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but do you think that's why that city is so conservative? Because people are coming from more like socialist countries?
100%, 100%. And especially the whole memory with Cuba and Kennedy, and, you know, they blame them, you know, so it's like, there's the blame that goes back that's anti-democrat. And then also, as you're saying, the affiliation of socialism with the Democratic Party, right, has been there. And it's something that they keep spinning. And the senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, is a master at constantly emphasizing to the Cuban American community down there, like, if you vote for, you know, Biden, you're going to be a socialist and you're going to welcome all this. So they do a good job of holding on to that narrative. It's breaking. There are cracks, right? But the narrative still holds pretty strong, even for millennials, Gen Zers. It still holds pretty strong. And of course, there are benefits that come with identifying as a conservative, you know, because there is a Cuban elite down there, and they kind of run the city, you know, no doubt about it. And so there is a benefit to being in allegiance with them. But I would say that I was kind of, you know, we were outsiders just because we were coming from Central America. And though the experiences were similar, there definitely was a majority of Cubans who really ran the city, as I was saying. And, you know, they had affiliations with each other's families going back to Cuba. And so here we were, you know, in a heavily Cuban environment as Central Americans. And it was a totally marginalizing experience for me, you know. And so I was always part of like the in groups with the other kids, but I always kept distance because I always loved to read since I was a kid. It was very weird. You know, my mom was like, "You're a weird kid."
I was the same. That's all I did. Yeah.
It's all I did. All I did. I love to read. And, you know, I remember being 4 reading Goosebumps. You know, it's like, I also got into Halloween as a kid and all this. And so I credit that. I credit my mother with opening up my imagination, because she would read to me, according to what she says. And I do remember when I was like 1.5, she would read Disney books, you know, and though she didn't understand English at that point or know how to read English, she just made it up based off of the pictures. And I just remember loving story time, right? So it was so funny. The words didn't matter. It was the pictures I was looking at, and then her words coming through. And that led to my love of reading and interpretation, right? And seeing the nuances of how to read and what people read and how we understand. And so I credit my mother for that. And, you know, just my experiences growing up in Hialeah, rough. Hialeah it's a pretty rough city in terms of, you know, you do see like gang violence from time to time, but it's a different type of gang violence. It's not the type you see in Los Angeles, you know, in like Compton or anything like that. It's very loose. It's just a bunch of kids who are claiming to be in gangs. And, so as a teenager, you have to learn how to navigate that.
Mm-hmm.
And you see things as a teenager, as I'm sure you saw, that you were like, this is not necessarily what I want to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've also, I'm sure, lost friends along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And have had experiences that just teach you that life is fleeting in many ways, right? Not just experiences on the street or outside, but also in the home, and the fragility of relationships. And, I think all these coalesce to kind of lead me to where I am today, right? And I do see myself as a nomad in many ways, so it's like, I don't have a place that I necessarily consider home. And I am open to moving from place to place and exploring different ideas, meeting different people. And there's this concept called the ethics of the passerby, which I see as very important in my life. And it's kind of like, you give a person care, you get to know them, but then when it's time to go, you move on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Without doing them harm. You just let them know this is a fleeting relationship, and let's learn as much as we can from each other and from each other's experiences without trying to own each other. And that's why I like the ethics of the passerby and the ethics of the nomad, really, right?
That's interesting. I was listening to something recently, and it described it as people like floating down a river, and you don't try to, like, if you're on an inner tube and there are, all these people that are going to inevitably be in your life, you can't hold on to every single person, because there are different people at different times, and those endings aren't a breakup, if you will. They're just a passing.
Exactly.
I like that.
And Maddie, that's beautiful. And also the fact that, at least I believe we never really fully know ourselves or understand ourselves, right? We're always discovering who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's impossible to try to grasp someone else, right? Or to, that phrase, to give ourselves fully to others. It's impossible, because we don't even have a full grasp on ourselves, right? And so I think that in ethics, there's already that breakdown when we say the other, and I. It assumes that there's a concrete I, and that I'm the center and you're the other. And that's just, to me, not useful in today's day and age, when, identity theories are floating and really confirming the fact that we are not broken pieces of ourselves. We are fragments that are always constantly remaking ourselves, right? So it's not like we're in search of something lost. We are building as we move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then there are pieces that get left behind, but that's not necessarily pieces that we want to recover.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Yeah. So competing ideas here,
Yeah, totally. I want to talk too about the op-ed that you wrote about hopelessness, because I think that ties in a lot. When I read it, to me, the way you described hopelessness was hopeful. And so I want to talk about that. There's a lot of things in that article I want to talk about. Can you just tell us those ideas that you're exploring right now?
Sure, absolutely. So hopelessness came about as I started reading a lot of these, Christian texts, and they all mention the word hope. And in conversation too, all I would hear is hope, the hope of tomorrow, the hope of a better world, the hope this, hope that.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to myself, okay, whenever a word gets overused and abused in that way, that's when my suspicion kicks in. It's like, why? So let me step back, and let me, as holy and sacrosanct as that word is, let me grab a hammer, as Nietzsche would say, right? And just smash it.
Mm-hmm.
And let's explore it once it's smashed. And so I've noticed that hope, and I'm not alone in this, the Afro-pessimists, especially a scholar by the name of Calvin Warren, in a book called Ontological Terror, he says, that hope has been mobilized for the last 150 years, for example, against the African-American community, to keep them complacent, right? And so the argument is, if you remove the concept of hope, and what I mean by that, let me be clear, I don't mean your personal hope, I don't mean my personal hope. It's something that I always have to clarify.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying, Maddie, please, like, be hopeless, forget about tomorrow in your life. I'm saying hope as we stake it again in a political spectrum, right? Or in a social, like, in a better world, coming about through politics or through or through law. So that's what I mean by hope. I mean hope in the systems that, first of all, have created the problems. They're not the same systems that are going to get us out. So we need to be hopeless when it comes to these systems, right? And then that's where the creativity and the imagination come through. Once you strip that hope in these institutions and these systems, then you stop being part of them. You stop, giving them your energy. You're going to have to find other ways, right? And other circles where these energies that you have can go, and, the outcome is still unexplored because we're still very much tied to coalitional politics and identity politics in many ways. And so it's like we're operating in a postmodern world on very modern assumptions, and very modern techniques. It's like running a meeting today around a table when we have Zoom, right? It's like that's what coalitional politics is doing. It's behind. And they use hope to sustain that. It's kind of like the gas, in the car. It's like have hope so you can get to that destination. What destination is that? Again, destination utopia, which we'll never get to. So, I'm inclined to aim high, but expect the results to fall way short, and then work with what you have in the present. And in that sense, I'm very much like Arthur Schopenhauer, in his book, Essays and Aphorisms here, it's like, there's this passage that I keep going back to. And then he says, work, worry, toil, and trouble are indeed the lot of almost all men and women, their whole life long. And yet, if every desire were satisfied as soon as it arose, how would these men and women occupy their lives? How would they pass the time? Imagine this race transported to a utopia where everything grows out of its own accord and turkeys fly around ready roasted, where lovers find one another without any delay and keep one another without any difficulty. In such a place, some men and women would die of boredom or hang themselves. Some would fight and kill one another, and thus they would create for themselves more suffering than nature inflicts on them as it is. Thus, for a race such as this, no stage, no form of existence is suitable other than the one already in process. And I think that's actually a very Buddhist teaching too. It's like, it's the moment, right? And hope has given us this teleology, this focus on the future always, and we forget to breathe in the present. And I think that's what's created most of our anxiety, most of our worries. It's hope actually that's killing us, right? And so what I say in the article is, let's take a sabbatical from hope. Let's give hope a rest, and let's see what happens, once we start envisioning other ways of transforming or changing the world.
The way that you wrote about hope and the way that you spoke about hope, I think when you read the title of the article, it sounds, pessimistic, negative, or nihilist, or whatever you want to say. But it's kind of the same idea as the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And I think usually when you come to the end of something, at least the topic that you were writing about is something I'm experiencing in my own life in a different way. But when you come to the end of doing something a certain way and it's not working, it's so incredibly frustrating and hopeless. Like, you do lose hope, but then at some point when everything blows up, you have to do it a different way. And that loss of hope in the previous way is what allowed you to find what you were looking for.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think I'm speechless, because that's precisely it. It's you come to a point, right, a break, where the old paradigms, the old ways of living, your own existence, all come into question and break down. And again, it's kind of that concept of taking the hammer, shattering things, and you fragmentize yourself in a way. But then the beautiful thing is, those shards that are there, right, you pick them up and you build another self, you reconstitute yourself. And I think that's the beauty and the hope here, that each day we do that without us. So we have to, the blocking of that's the problem. It's like, and that's where hope and teleology comes in. It's the hope is that there is this unified self that's moving through time and space, and that it'll get to a destination. But then my question is, okay, so once you get to that destination, then what? It's, again, the anxiety producing question, because it's like, okay, people, for example, save to buy a house. Okay, cool. You get to your house, you buy your house, you have your white picket fence, all that stuff. Now what? Then you're going to aim for something else. And it's always this constant, like, let me get to it and let me have hope in this and hope in that and hope. And rather than, no, let's see the joy behind breaking ourselves, fragmentizing ourselves, picking up those shards and building an imperfect mirror, right? Which will never see our reflection whole. What will happen then? And I think you're doing it. I think I'm doing it. I think there are many people who are doing it. It's just a matter of talking about it and saying it's okay to feel like pieces, rather than a whole. Because at the end of the day, a whole is a fiction. There's no such thing. We're extending ourselves constantly in different directions. Every time we meet someone, it's that person takes a piece of us, and then you take a piece of that person, right? And sometimes it's unknown what pieces you're taking and giving. So it's always a reconstitution of the self. And that's something that Foucault was exploring, in the 1960s and 70s, and people thought he was insane. Yeah.
I think too that some of those religious ideas that we hear of, like you were saying before, hope is such an overused term, sort of. And that idea of, in Christianity at least, it's all going to be okay because one day we're going to die and go to heaven and it's going to be paradise. But I don't think, in my eyes, that philosophy isn't really what a lot of the Bible's teaching and Jesus' teaching is saying. I think it's kind of taken and applied to our culture, and this sort of prosperity gospel idea, or the ideals of America kind of built into, hard work, and if you do all of this, then you'll eventually get everything you want. I mean, it's sort of the American dream, but taken into a philosophical paradigm.
Absolutely, right? You have the Protestant ethic,
Yeah.
And then also tied into that, the whole self-care industry, right? So it's also a secular phenomenon. It's not just a religious one. I mean, the whole self-care industry is, one of these days I went to Barnes and Noble, and it's like one of the few sections that's thriving at Barnes and Noble is the self-help, self-management section. And you can see that there is a thirst for it. So people are interested in what we're talking about here. It's just a matter of how deep can we go with them, right? Is it a surface self-care? Throw in some bath bombs, light some candles. Hey, that's important. I do it all the time, right? But the deeper self-care is actually painful. It's like undoing oneself, especially at moments when you feel like you got to figure it out. And that's hard and that hurts. Or the other experience, when things seem to be going okay, and then suddenly you hit some type of unexpected event or some catastrophe or some trauma, and you can't shake it, right? So it's like, what do we do in those situations? And that's what deep self-care is about.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. I feel like that whole movement has taken place as first of all, COVID happened. And so people had a lot of anxiety, and mental health is struggling as a country and all of these things. But also it's kind of coming at the same time as a decline of having really strong religious ethics as part of the moral code of society, I guess. I don't know, because we used to go to these, and I would consider myself religious even, but we used to go to maybe churches or institutions or religious texts or these kinds of things for those questions. But now there is, in some sense, a loss of that, and people are searching for answers and searching for meaning. And
I think that's beautiful. And you're absolutely right about that. The dynamics have changed, and that's why the whole spiritual but not religious, it's really, really taking off, right? And the numbers show that will only increase, that category of so-called religious nuns, and so I think it's important to support that, actually, because what they're doing, for example, there's Instagram pages, about crystals or, tarot readings. And what they're doing is they're being eclectic. They're blending traditional religion with traditional spirituality, with esoteric, stuff, with pagan mythology. I mean, it's like, it's a beautiful blending that I see. And something that in my research on these pages that I've discovered, on Instagram especially, they're mostly run by women. you know? And so it's like one page in particular has like 3 million followers, and it's one about crystals. I forget what it's called exactly, but you know, that's pretty incredible, right? Just the amount of people that are going to these pages and building their own spirituality out of it. You know, and I also know several friends who, when I go to their homes, it's like they have little altars with like crystals or incense or candles, you know, and it's a beautiful thing to see that people are taking spirituality and religion into their own, right? And kind of just as they're doing with their own identities and personalities, creating something eclectic, something fresh from the pieces. And so that gives me a lot of hope.
Hope in your hopelessness.
Hopelessness. Yeah.
Have you read anything by Ken Wilber about spiral dynamics?
No.
Oh, you would love that. I haven't read his entire book. I don't know that spiral dynamics is his original idea or not. I think there are a lot of people that write on it. Ken Wilber actually, you know Ken Kitatani, don't you, from the SSGN?
Yes.
I think he works with him in the same UN department. But he is like a prominent modern philosopher, and he writes about spiral dynamics being sort of like stages of human consciousness. So
wow.
At the beginning, you'd be really interested in this. I'm sure you'd love his book, but at the beginning, he's talking about, I can't remember all the stages off the top of my head, but the initial stages are like archaic. So you can think of like cavemen, the idea that like God is in the sky because we pray to the sky for rain and it comes, those kinds of things. But then as you move through the stages of consciousness, it comes to something being more like what we're seeing in religion and spirituality today, being less sort of denominational or separate in different ways, but in more of a connected, holistic spirituality that you're talking about. But the interesting thing is it's not just stages of history necessarily. There's stages that we as humans all go through throughout our lives, and then they can be happening, coexisting together within us at different times. But
that sounds, I mean, now that's definitely fascinating. Thank you. I'll definitely check that out. Yeah, it reminds me, it's interesting. Marguerite Porriet, she was a mystic of, I think, 1200s, 1300s. She was a Beguine, and these were women who would live in community and not necessarily sisters, right? So they weren't necessarily
nuns.
Yeah. Marguerite Porriet was actually lay. She was never a nun. And she wrote this book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. And it's really an understudied text, right? Because it's not in the same vein as Teresa de Avila, for example, who makes it clear that it's Jesus that she felt, you know, and in the form of kind of an orgasm in many ways, right? Whereas Marguerite Porriet is more mysterious, right? And she has what are called the stages of the soul, how the soul moves, but she neglects to mention what happens in the final stage, right? And she also says that once the soul gets past a certain stage, it can actually bounce around for all eternity, right? So it's like it can be in level 6 for a little bit and then go back to level 4. And I find that very refreshing, just because, again, as humans, and there's also research going on with addiction and relapsing, right, that could tie into this, right? As a soul never moves perfectly from stage 1 to stage 7. You know, there was this famous book back in the 80s, 70s, 80s, I think, James Fowler, Stages of Faith Development. And, you know, lately it's been critiqued because he followed a very hierarchical, step-by-step pyramid kind of system of faith development. And I think Marguerite Porriet was onto something, you know, 900, 800 years ago, when she was talking about the soul bouncing around and, you know, you won't know what it feels like until you experience it, falling into ecstasy with God, etc. And she was condemned and, of course, burned, you know, at the stake, as most powerful women who wrote back then were. And so I think it's a text that's understudied. And I think, you know, I invite the audience and everyone to just look it up. And even her Wikipedia page is pretty good. So Margaret Porriet, the book is called Mirror of Simple Souls.
Okay, I will definitely look that up.
Yeah.
Where do you think this spirituality piece becomes important in the sustainability movement? And we can include in the sustainability movement like environmental justice, or pertaining to social justice and things like that too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as I mentioned at the outset, our time is different, not because we have new technologies, and yeah, of course that makes certain things different, but history is a loop in many ways, and histories are loops. But what makes our time distinct is that we actually are destroying our home, right? And we have the capacity to do so, and we are doing so. Many have argued that we're actually past a turning point where we can actually reverse ecological damage. And even Ecclesiastes, right, for once, is wrong on something here. So Ecclesiastes as a biblical text is pretty spot on, I think, philosophically. It talks about, again, nothing new under the sun. It talks about how we toil for no reason, how new generations will replace old ones, and just the drama of life continues to unfold on the stage with no change. But what, of course, they could not foresee was humans intervening in the natural world, and humans being capable of actually destroying life on this planet. And we see that, right? And so I think the spirituality that comes in quite useful today is, again, the spirituality of, in remaking ourselves, we remake our lifestyles. We remake the way we relate to resources. We acknowledge our role in this. No one is innocent. Even infants, whom we like to, consider innocent. Unfortunately, an infant born in the United States, for example, consumes about 60 to 75% more resources than an infant, let's say, born in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And that already places that infant at some level of culpability. It's like vis-a-vis the others. And so I think getting rid of fantasies of innocence is a first step. And I think part of that spirituality that can help us is by retooling our reconceptions of ourselves to begin with, right? And saying, I am not innocent. And we need to repeat that to ourselves. It's like, I am not innocent. And then from there, starting to right the wrongs that we do. So how can we offset, for example, right, the disparity of resources among infants in different continents? How can we acknowledge that we are all part of a death-dealing machine, right? Even if you're a vegetarian, vegan, think of the resources that you are preventing other animals from consuming, right? So the list goes on and on. We're complacent in this, and I think that's a very scary realization, especially for people who perceive their lives to be for justice, right? Because there does have to come that moment of reckoning, and then I think that's when spirituality becomes crucial. It's by saying, all right, I recognize this. I recognize my faults. I recognize how complacent I am. Capitalism is everywhere at all times. So now how can I move on rather than become paralyzed by the analysis? Martin Luther King would always say, beware of paralysis of analysis. So I think a spirituality that is strong, that is robust, and that also is honest about our place in the cosmos and our relation to each other, to the natural world, I think that can help start a paradigm revolution that can just help us conceive of new lifestyles. That just, that includes marriages, that includes relationships. It has to be a reconstitution of everything. It just can't be like economic reconstitution. It has to start from the way we envision families, the way we envision our relationships to ourselves, to others. That's where it all starts.
What do you mean by that part?
By which part?
That re-envisioning everything.
So yeah, so
that part of everything.
It begins from within, because since Ivan Illich has a good book called Deschooling Society, right? Because it starts from the moment we're 2, 3, right? Even before that, but it starts as soon as your cognition starts to grasp. You start learning ways of being. You start learning paradigms. You start normalizing behaviors just because you see, for example, your parents doing it, or members of the community doing it. So there's a learning that takes place, but then we have to get to a point of unlearning what we've learned, and that's very hard. It's part of this reconstitution of the self, and that's why community also becomes important, right? Different types of community, not just one. It's like, it's pretty cool to belong to 5 communities, and they're all different, and I often envision what would it feel like to go to a bar, for example, with 3 people from this community and 2 people from this community and me, and it's like all these reconfigurations that are possible. So I often think of that, and I think that's the configurations. We have to think about that as well, who we associate with, and what would happen if we put those in dialogue, those different pieces of our lives, right? What conversations would emerge? And so what I mean by everything is really everything we're taught, from our desires, because desires are taught, right? It's like, what you find desirable is learned, it's acquired.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of that deep work is also kind of saying, well, why do I desire this? Why don't I desire this? And then coming to grapple with that too, right? And seeing what comes out of that grappling. So and this is what I mean by the constant self-care. It's hard, it's not easy, it's very tiring. It's like being on a treadmill, and then you see, you have 2 minutes left, you kind of feel relief, but then you have to go back on, and it's like a constant work. And that's called deep self-care. And that's why, the facile self-care is important too, because you can't do this all the time, right? You'll just break down constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do need things that you enjoy that some would consider shallow or facile. So I'm not here to say, stay away from that. No, retail
Pleasure is important.
Pleasure is important, things you enjoy. So I'm here to advocate for both the deep self-care, right, which is a constant self-reconstitution of the self and interrogation of the self, especially at moments when you feel most settled. So let me repeat that. Especially when you think you have it all figured out, that's when you really need to break yourself down, right? And then throw in a couple bath bombs and light some candles and celebrate the victories, and acknowledge the defeats, and just continue. That's life.
Do you mean self-examination, sort of, when you're talking about deep self-care? Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Sure. So there are several practices actually that come from the Greeks.
Okay.
So the Stoics were very good with this. So one is, so they would separate it between exams that you would do on yourself, and then physical, actually, like trials, right? So you would push your body, for example, to certain limits to see what you're made of, right? So we see that mentality in the gym, for example, right? We see that mentality on shirts. It's like push yourself to the limit, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm talking about more are the exams. Yes. Okay. Where you, for example, there's this practice where you visualize everything that can go wrong in your life. That was a Greek practice, right? They would tell you, sit. It was a Greek and Roman. You would sit with yourself in a room, not talk to anyone for a week, and you would visualize for an entire week, every day, worst case scenario of everything in your life. And then you would jot down notes how you would feel, at moments, right? And then when you're done with that, you come back and you're like, okay, I just envisioned the worst. Now what's the best? Right? And then you would see that your feelings obviously, oscillate, they fluctuate. And so the point is to reach kind of a middle, like if it happens, it happens, whether it's good or bad, right? And again, a lot of this traces itself back to Buddhism in many ways. It's very strange how all these philosophies and world religions coalesce in many ways. The Buddhists would say there's no such thing as good or bad, right? All events are neutral, and we assign it that meaning of good or bad. And of course, can be pushback on all these viewpoints and worldviews, but I think it's important to take stock of ourselves from time to time and say, yes, things are going well, relatively speaking, but what would happen if this changes, right? And it's kind of like playing with equations with yourself. It's like, let's envision worst case scenario. Another one is envision your death. It's like, who would be there? What would people be saying about you? Not that it matters, but it's just, again, for you to start playing with your imagination, right? About life events that we don't want to think about, but that yet we all will go through. It's inevitable, right? We all will die. And so death has always been on my mind ever since I was a kid too. And it's like, I have a fascination with skulls. I have plenty tattooed on me, and I actually have a couple on my desk. And because for some reason, death, that's obviously the ultimate escape from this loop that we're talking about, right? And I'm not romanticizing it. So, you know, I often get that pushback, are you romanticizing death and all that? And I'm saying, no, I'm not romanticizing it, but I am acknowledging it. And I am saying that it is already everywhere at all times, you know? And so again, what do we do with that acknowledgement? So yeah, it is a taking stock of oneself. It's also a reflection that some would say is macabre, right? But it's not, it's death, you know? When was the last time you went through a cemetery, just walked around?
Recently.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I actually live across one, and it's like,
Yeah.
it's beautiful. I
Mm-hmm.
go and I walk, and there's this, you know, sometimes I read the tombstones.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I feel the energies sometimes, right? But there's also this peace. There's also this peace because we don't know what's on the other side. And whether you're a deep materialist who thinks that it's over once we die, or, you know, you're very spiritual, following Platonic kind of leanings, that you think the spirit continues and or morphs, or, you know, returns in different ways. We know nobody knows, and so we're all going to take that journey eventually. And wouldn't that be a form of solidarity?
Yeah.
If we understand that we will all die, right? And in many ways, that's the great equalizer as well. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of peace in it too, because I think ultimately at the end of a lot of anxiety is the fear of death. You know, even everyone's fear of coronavirus, they weren't afraid of getting a cough, they were afraid of dying.
Yeah.
As much as I know people don't speak about that or maybe want to admit it, but I know for myself, when I get to the end of anxieties I've experienced lately, that's what it is. And so when you can kind of come to terms with the fact that it's inevitable, it's going to happen to everyone, it's not so scary anymore.
Yeah. And that's where Ecclesiastes, for example, you know, comes in. It's like, nothing new under the sun. We all will die and we all will be replaced. It's life.
Mm-hmm.
Again, what they did not foresee was, well, you know, given the ecological devastation that we're seeing today and the ability to destroy a planet, we might not be replaced. And that's also fine. You know, that's,
Mm-hmm.
we need to come to terms with our egos in all this, you know. And again, this is what I mean by reconstituting paradigms, right? Childbirth, for example, is seen as, and it is a beautiful thing, of course, right? But it's seen as, you know, people must go through this. Women must give birth. Like, it's like, well, no, wait a minute. You know, there are plenty who can't or don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be acknowledged too as part of a lifestyle, part of a way of living, right? And at the end, what is it, right? Are we replacing ourselves? Is that the whole point of having children? Or is it, you know, to give a child a life we did not have, right? But that's also an ego thing. So we also have to just, with everything that we do, kind of say, let me step back and ask myself the deeper question of, why am I doing this? You know, is it I'm following a script? Am I making up for something? And that's where, you know, insecurities come through. That's where anxieties heighten. But that's where the work is of reconstituting ourselves and constantly rewiring and rewriting ourselves.
Yeah. And I think there's a real benefit to doing that before. I mean, sometimes you're forced to do that because things fall apart.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That's one of the greatest ways to grow. But if you can do that continually in your life without that catalyst, that's even better, because you're not, I mean, I wouldn't say better, but we aren't all faced with things that cause our whole lives to fall apart every day. That doesn't happen to everyone or very often. But yeah, I really like those practices that you said, because I think we see them like in little micro ways. People don't sit in a room and think about the worst possible scenario for a week, but I've heard that people practicing that, you know, like give yourself 10 minutes to worry every day and think about, you know, all of these anxieties you have, and give it a time and a place, and then don't do it for the rest of the day. Because then it does, why we're worrying is because we're thinking this thing might happen and we're thinking we have to figure it out. But if we give ourselves time to say, okay, what if this does happen? What will I do? Then we don't have to spend the time worrying, because we allowed ourselves.
Absolutely.
Not a week maybe, but 20 minutes.
Exactly, right? And again, these are the practices, of course, they recommended back then, right? Because there were different times, different, you know, abilities to sit. Normally, we don't have a week to just sit in a room and reflect on, you know, the worst that can happen. So yeah, even a 10-minute reflection, right? A 5-minute reflection, daily. Think about how that would change. It's like, what's the worst that can happen to me today? And you journal rather than waking up with the cliche of, let me journal my best thoughts, my intentions for the day, which is fine too. But starting from the kind of the negative way, right, is fascinating. And also, I think not comparing yourself is essential. There's, of course, the phrase, comparison is the thief of all joy.
Mm-hmm.
And also being careful not to compare ourselves to others in a worse situation as well, right? Because then that also robs us of the introspection that we need to do, because you're making yourself feel better by looking at somebody else in a worse situation. That's not being introspective. That's being narcissistic in many ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that temptation too of reflections going in different ways. But that's also the beauty of our thoughts, that they're ours. And no matter what they are, you're free to think what you want, right? And the fear is when, governments or religious ideologies or political programs or even educational programs want to control even your thoughts, right? So now it's not just your body that can be regulated. Now it's also what you're thinking. And that becomes, that's when you have to step back and say, all right, I am living in a totalitarian world here, in many ways, a fascist world. And I don't see that with Gen Z, though. I think the students I teach are very much free with their thoughts. They're thinking many things that, I'm happy that they are. And yes, some might go into a so-called darker direction or negative direction. But again, that's part of life. It's like, it is part of life. There are so many people living in precarity. Actually, I would say the vast majority of the human race lives in precarity. And by precarity, I mean no welfare state to back them up, no systems of care. It's just like you're left out there exposed, and good luck, try to survive. And I think we don't have empathy generally for people living in precarity, right? And so some of these thought exercises might be a way to sympathize, at least. Not empathize, because you would need to be in that same situation, but at least sympathize. At least say, I understand why this person is breaking into a store to steal food.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, because, they don't have money to eat, because they don't have a job, because the economy, blah, 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 right? And it goes on and on and on. And so it's a deeper level of understanding of self that leads to a deeper empathy and sympathy for others.
Yeah. Yeah, you couldn't have said that better. And that's, again, I feel that is a strong power of today, is we have the ability to hear more stories. Even in my own life, I've been lucky, and this is not the case for everyone, but my parents just raised me in places where I was surrounded by a lot of diversity. And so I feel like that upbringing and seeing and living in these places as a child has changed the way that I view everything. And not everyone is going to have really, like, my parents are just very relational, and they put us in those situations as children. Like, for example, when you were speaking about the guy robbing the store, like, my dad has a good friend. He met him, he wrote him a letter. He was in the newspaper. He was in prison, and he read, like, the court case in the newspaper, and he started writing him for years and years and years, because he was in prison for a while, and he had, like, robbed a bank, armed robbery, but was on drugs. He was trying to get drug money. And you hear that and you're like, oh, what a terrible person. Like, who would do something like that, But this guy has, this whole story of his life that led him to being that person. When he was a teenager, his mom made him work and then would take his paycheck to buy drugs, So it's like, you see these things, and you see these people that do things on the news, and you get angry, but then there's also a very real humanness attached to this story, and there's something that created this person that caused them to do these things. And that's the other side of every, I mean, this sounds really morbid, but, like, that's on the other side of every, like, school shooting and every crime and all of these horrible things we hear about. Yeah, it's not okay, but I think it speaks to a greater problem than just what's happening.
Absolutely. Your reflection couldn't have been more spot on, I think. And I appreciate you being honest, with the discussion. And yes, even something as touchy, right, as a school shooting.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that's okay at all. That's not what I mean.
Definitely. But that's why I appreciate you like
Yeah.
because many people would even just shy away from, talking about that. And I think again, that says a lot about our inability to dig deep and to explore these topics, right? For fear of, being misunderstood or being canceled,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think we're moving beyond that though. So I think it's a good indication that we are moving beyond that. And there are ideas that do deserve pushback, but I think if we don't have these discussions in the open, all that happens is these discussions take place underground, and they'll take place in chat rooms where people can be radicalized in different points of views. So the importance just of conversation, and I know that our first conversation was about conversation,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why I appreciate our conversations, because I think you bring up so many points that are neglected, and the ability to dig deep. I think it's something that I wouldn't say lost, because that would create a myth of some time in the past people were all deep. No,
Mm-hmm.
again, humanity we are what we are. We're imperfect, we're different, and we should celebrate that difference of all types of difference, right? Cognitive, emotional, etc., physical, ideological. So I'm all for difference, but I do think that we struggle with the ability to have deep conversations that get to the root causes of what we see, right? Because again, the way the news stylizes it is, guns are the problem. And it's like, sure, guns are the problem, but somebody has to pull that trigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And why do people pull that trigger? And how could anybody ever aim at another person and even think of doing that? There has to be a deeper, conversation that has to take place. But guess what? It doesn't make it into the political sound bites, right? And it also doesn't play into party politics.
Exactly.
And that's why I'm saying let's have a little bit of hopelessness when it comes to politics, the establishment, right? Because I think, at the end of the day, politicians that's what they do. That's their job. And they get paid, and, their interests. And ever since Citizens United, that disastrous decision that allowed, unlimited funding for political campaigns by corporations, ever since that decision was affirmed, politics and politicians can be bought, more than ever. And that's a scary thought, but it's also a thought that we need to grapple with and say, we need to come up with new ways to resist or to discuss, to engage these issues. And so I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't know if you see anything that gives you hope in particular in terms of resistance. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I think as I was reflecting on your article and listening to the podcast this morning, which I'll link it in the notes for this podcast too, because it was interesting. It's not that we're losing hope, I feel. It's almost that we're putting our hope in the wrong places, in the wrong things. And I think there is great hope in like human empathy and compassion and all of these things that I think are inherently good about people. There are things that are inherently bad about people or primal or these sorts of things. But I think there is a lot of hope that we can put in the human story too, that has the power to change a lot. And that is the power that I see in this day of age with connectivity and media, is that we all of a sudden have like women. This is kind of a silly example, but the rise of social media and like being an influencer has created a huge, huge job market for women. Like suddenly a stay-at-home mother can be making 6 figures, And so all of these kind of changes and shifts, especially in media can be terrible and so polarizing. And I hate it sort of in the political arena, but at the same time, all of these people have voices and can have discussions and can be connected to each other all around the globe. And we can suddenly see the people that our decisions are affecting, and it makes it much more personal. And so I think that and the ability to just have conversations with each other. And I mean, it's always a little, I find myself being afraid to speak sometimes about certain things because of kind of the hostility and the attitude and cancel culture and all of these things. But I also really, really value maybe one day I'm going to say something offensive and someone can gently tell me, hey, don't say this in that way. And I'll learn and I won't do it again, as opposed to, someone deleting me, whatever, canceling me. So those are things I find hope in, and just conversation that can never be taken away.
I'm with you. And I think, what you're speaking about here is so important. 20 years ago, right? If you wanted to get your voice out there, it only could be through authorized platforms or authorized venues, right? Now it's like, as you said, you can start your own blog, right? You can do a podcast, you can do, so many things, social media, you can go live, you can do your TikToks, and that has created, you're absolutely correct, spaces for all voices to come in, and again, talk across difference. And that does give me hope, right? And I think I see you as doing it, and that gives me hope. I follow your blog and your page, and I love everything you post, from the stuff you write to the pictures you post.
Thank you.
And I think there's something there with the art, the artistry, the aesthetics, right, that can move people toward acts of resistance that are much deeper than let me go argue before Congress, or let me try to convince 5 voters to vote for me because. And that speaks to the public sphere, I think, right? There are different ways to speak in the public sphere. It's not just the traditional argumentation. And I get it. It's important to learn how to argue, but, street performance, as we've talked about, right? Street theater. There's also shock value that goes to conveying something. I think of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. They do wonderful things in San Francisco. They've since spread out all across the world, but if you don't know about the sisters, they are men who dress as nuns, so yeah. And it's not for parody. So they don't say they're making fun of nuns and disrespecting them. They're mimicking them.
Okay.
But they're shocking because their names are also funny. I'll spare you the names because some of them are very explicit. But it's like Sister Boom Boom, for example, is one. But what they do is they dress and they march. They collect money for HIV/AIDS awareness, for trans awareness now, right? And they are very effective because what can you do if you're a 5-year-old, right, walking down the street and you see, these nuns that are 8-9 feet tall because of stilettos, and you're like, whoa, it's like, of course that's going to jar your mind and going to jog your imagination. You will ask your parents or your guardians questions of what this is, and who knows where that conversation can go, right? And the same can't be said about picking up a book anymore, because you can just avoid that. But if you see a sister like that walking down the street, there's no way to avoid that, right? Your eyesight will meet that. And so there are different ways now to communicate in the public sphere. There always have, of course, but it's important to acknowledge these so-called unauthorized spaces that call into question power dynamics. Before, for example, who used to be the gatekeepers of these spaces? That's been eliminated. It's like screw the gatekeeper, put your voice out there. And I'm glad that you are speaking up and putting your voice out there because it's as necessary as anybody else's.
Thank you. I haven't done, I used to write and create a lot of stuff, and I haven't done that as much recently, but we go through seasons of things, and sometimes you just don't feel like making anything, and that's fine.
Absolutely. Sometimes I shut down and there's no content, and people are like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I am. This is my time of reflection or self-care even, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a real push too now with, how there's a whole nother conversation, but kind of like staying relevant, or how platforms work, or creating content just for the sake of creating things, when really that's not how things in nature work.
Mm-hmm.
There are seasons to create things, and I think that's not in Ecclesiastes, is it? I don't think so.
It is.
It is?
Right. Yes.
Yeah, that we keep coming back to that book, but there's like a season for this. I can't quote the whole thing, but it's basically saying like that's another sort of capitalistic, very American idea of production, industrial. Yeah. And that's just not the reality of how humans work, how nature works, how anything works.
Nope. We need time to refresh. We need time to take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
Burnout is real, and it creeps up on you in the most unexpected ways. I know for me, burnout creeps up when I'm reading something and I'm like doubting whether the comma should go there. Something that comes so natural as right. And it's like, oh my goodness, that's when I know I need to turn everything off and get some rest, or just go out for a walk or a jog or, bike ride, etc., just to get my mind off of it. So I think having these practices, they're crucial. They're crucial.
Well, I think we have less than a minute according to Zoom, but it was great to talk with you, CJ. Definitely. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And, please, if you want to have another conversation, I would love that. And, if you want to involve others too in it, that would be great,
Great.
But I really appreciate you and your platform, and nothing but gratitude. So
likewise. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.